Good evening, and welcome to the Sleeping Zoo. Facts to fall asleep to. To look upon a single honeybee is to view only a fragment of a much larger and more complex biological masterpiece. While we often perceive the individual insect as the unit of life, modern biology invites us to shift our perspective toward the concept of the superorganism. In this view, the honeybee colony functions as a single living entity where the individual bees act as specialized cells within a body. No single bee can survive or reproduce in isolation for long, but together they exhibit a collective intelligence and a homeostatic stability that rivals the most complex vertebrate organisms. This unity of purpose is the defining characteristic of the genus Apis, and it begins with a radical commitment to a communal existence that has been refined over 30 million years of evolution. The architecture of this superorganism is built upon a sophisticated social structure known as temporal polyethism. This system dictates that a worker bee does not hold a single job for her entire life, but rather progresses through a series of roles based on her physiological age. In her first days, after emerging from her hexagonal cell, the young worker acts as a cleaner, meticulously preparing cells for the next generation of larvae. As she ages and her internal glands develop, she transitions into the role of a nurse bee. Her hypopharyngeal and mandibular glands begin to secrete royal jelly and worker jelly, the nutrient-dense substances required to raise the brood. Once those glands begin to atrophy, she moves to the middle of the hive to act as a processor, receiving nectar from returning foragers, building wax comb, or guarding the entrance. It is only in the final stages of her short, frantic life that she leaves the darkness of the hive to become a forager, braving the elements to find the resources that sustain the collective. To understand how these thousands of individuals operate with such precision, we must look closely at the physical tools they possess. The anatomy of the honeybee is a marvel of evolutionary engineering, designed for high-frequency aerial maneuvers and the detection of microscopic chemical signals. A bee possesses 5 eyes in total, consisting of 2 large compound eyes and 3 smaller primitive eyes called ocelli. The compound eyes are composed of thousands of individual hexagonal lenses or ommatidia, which allow the bee to detect rapid movements and navigate using the polarization of sunlight, even on overcast days. These eyes perceive a spectrum of light that is invisible to human beings, specifically the ultraviolet range. To a honeybee, a field of flowers is not just a sea of color, but a landscape of high-contrast landing strips. Many flowers have evolved ultraviolet nectar guides that are invisible to us but act as glowing beacons to the bee, directing her toward the center of the bloom, where the rewards are greatest. The 3 ocelli, located in a triangular pattern on the top of the head, do not form images but are acutely sensitive to light intensity. These organs act as a celestial compass, helping the bee maintain her orientation relative to the horizon and the sun. This visual system is paired with a sense of smell that is several hundred times more sensitive than our own. The antennae of the honeybee are covered in thousands of sensory organs called sensilla, which can detect specific pheromones and floral scents in the air at concentrations of just a few parts per trillion. This olfactory prowess allows the colony to communicate through a complex chemical language, where distinct pheromones can signal an alarm, mark a food source, or indicate the presence and health of the queen. Beyond sight and smell, the honeybee possesses a hidden sense that has only recently begun to be understood by science: electroreception. As a bee flies through the air, the friction of the wind against her body creates a positive static charge. Flowers, which are grounded in the earth, typically hold a negative charge. When a bee approaches a blossom, the difference in electrical potential creates a subtle force that can pull pollen grains off the anther and onto the bee's fuzzy body even before she touches the plant. Furthermore, once a bee has visited a flower, she leaves behind a trace of her electrical charge, which alters the floral field. Subsequent bees can sense this change, allowing them to know that a flower has recently been depleted of its nectar without having to land and investigate, thereby optimizing the energetic efficiency of the entire colony. This pollen, once collected, must be transported back to the hive with mechanical efficiency. The hind legs of the worker bee are equipped with specialized structures known as corbiculae, or pollen baskets. These are smooth, concave regions surrounded by stiff hairs. The bee uses her other legs to comb the pollen from her body, mixing it with a small amount of nectar to make it sticky, and then packs it into these baskets. By the time she returns to the hive, she may be carrying as much as 35% of her own body weight in pollen. This substance, often referred to as bee bread, once it is fermented with enzymes inside the hive, serves as the primary protein source for the developing brood. The survival of the colony depends on more than just the collection of resources. It requires the maintenance of a precise internal environment. Even in the height of summer or the depths of winter, the honeybee superorganism maintains a consistent temperature in its brood nest of approximately 35 degrees Celsius. This thermal regulation is achieved through collective behavior. When the hive becomes too warm, workers gather at the entrance and use their wings to create a sophisticated ventilation system, drawing cool air in and pushing warm air out. If the temperature continues to rise, they will forage for water and spread it in thin films over the comb, using evaporative cooling to lower the temperature. Conversely, in the winter, the bees form a tight cluster around the queen and the brood. By decoupling their flight muscles from their wings and vibrating them at high frequencies, they generate metabolic heat, effectively turning their own bodies into tiny heaters to ensure the collective does not perish in the cold. Every action taken by an individual bee is governed by the needs of the whole, a dynamic that is orchestrated by a constant flow of information. The queen, though often thought of as a ruler, is more accurately described as the colony's reproductive heart. She produces a suite of chemicals known as queen mandibular pheromone, which acts as a social glue. This pheromone is passed from bee to bee through trophallaxis, the ritualized exchange of liquid food. As long as this chemical signal is present and strong, it suppresses the reproductive urges of the workers and maintains the social order. The moment the signal wanes, whether due to the queen's age or her absence, the colony immediately begins the process of raising a new successor, demonstrating an inherent capacity for self-correction and survival that is hardwired into their very DNA. While the physical senses of the bee allow it to perceive a hidden world of electrical charges and ultraviolet light, it is the ability to communicate these findings that elevates the honeybee to a pinnacle of social evolution. This communication finds its most profound expression in the Waggle Dance, a symbolic language that translates the geometry of the outside world into a series of rhythmic movements performed in the total darkness of the hive. When a scout bee finds a rich source of nectar or pollen, she returns to the vertical surface of the comb and begins to move in a figure-8 pattern. The central portion of this figure, the waggle run, is where the critical data is encoded. The angle of this run relative to a vertical line represents the angle of the food source relative to the sun. If the bee runs straight up the comb, the food is located directly toward the sun. If she runs at an angle 60 degrees to the right of vertical, the foragers know to fly 60 degrees to the right of the sun's position. The complexity of this behavior is staggering when one considers that the sun is a moving target. As the minutes and hours pass, the sun's azimuth shifts across the sky, yet the bees inside the dark hive remain perfectly calibrated. They possess an internal biological clock that allows them to adjust the angle of their dance to account for the sun's movement over time. Furthermore, the duration of the waggle run is directly proportional to the distance of the forage. For every additional second the bee spends vibrating her abdomen during the straight run, she adds approximately 1 kilometer to the flight distance. This is not a simple linear calculation, as the bee also factors in the energetic cost of the journey, adjusting the dance to account for headwinds or heavy terrain. Through this dance, the scout provides a 3-dimensional map to her sisters, allowing the colony to rapidly mobilize thousands of foragers to exploit a fleeting resource before it vanishes. The willingness of a worker to work herself to death for her sisters is not merely a product of social pressure, but is rooted in a unique and fascinating genetic structure known as haploidiploid. In most animal species, offspring receive half of their genes from their mother and half from their father, resulting in siblings who share 50% of their DNA. However, in the honeybee colony, the system is fundamentally different. Drones, the males of the hive, are produced from unfertilized eggs and therefore possess only one set of chromosomes from the queen. They have no father. When a queen mates, she stores millions of sperm in a specialized organ called a spermatheca, using them to fertilize the eggs that will become female workers. Because all the sperm from a single drone are genetically identical, and workers receive half of the queen's genome, sisters in a honeybee hive share 75% of their genes. This genetic asymmetry creates a powerful evolutionary incentive for altruism. From a mathematical perspective, a worker bee can pass on more of her genetic legacy by helping her mother produce more sisters than she ever could by trying to produce her own offspring. This high coefficient of relatedness is the engine of the hive's extreme cooperation, explaining why a worker will readily sacrifice her life to sting an intruder, or spend her final days foraging until her wings are literally shredded. The hive is a genetic fortress where the individual is secondary to the preservation of the shared lineage, a living proof of the selfish gene theory operating at a massive scale. While the genetics provide the motivation for the colony, the physical infrastructure is provided by the bees' own bodies. The construction of the hive is a feat of chemical and structural engineering that has fascinated mathematicians for centuries, most notably through the honeycomb conjecture. To house their brood and store their food, bees produce beeswax from specialized glands on the underside of their abdomen. They consume large amounts of honey to fuel the metabolic process of wax production, then chew the flakes to make them pliable. The resulting hexagonal cells are a masterpiece of spatial efficiency. A hexagon is the only shape that can tile a flat plane without leaving any gaps, while simultaneously minimizing the amount of material required to create a specific volume of storage. By choosing this geometry, the honeybee ensures that the hive is both incredibly light and structurally robust, capable of supporting 30 times its own weight in honey. The production of that honey is itself a complex chemical transformation. It begins with the collection of nectar, a watery solution of sucrose, glucose, and fructose. Once the forager returns to the hive, she passes the nectar to a receiver bee through trophallaxis. During this process, the bees add an enzyme called invertase, which begins to break down the complex sucrose into simpler sugars. This enzymatic action is only the first step. To prevent the nectar from fermenting or spoiling, the bees must reduce its water content from around 80% to less than 18%. This is achieved through a collective effort of dehydration. Bees spread the nectar into thin films within the cells, and then gather in groups to fan their wings in a synchronized rhythm, creating a constant airflow that pulls moisture from the liquid. Once the honey reaches the perfect consistency, it becomes naturally antibacterial and antifungal, an eternal food source that the bees seal with a layer of fresh wax for long-term storage. This storage is essential for the winter cluster, a phase of the colony's life that demonstrates their mastery over thermodynamics. As temperatures drop, the bees do not hibernate. Instead, they retreat to the center of the hive, forming a dense ball around the queen. The bees on the outer layer of the cluster act as insulation, tucking their heads inward and creating a living heat shield. The bees in the center consume the stored honey and vibrate their flight muscles to generate heat. As the outer bees become cold, they move to the center to warm up, and the warm bees move outward to take their place. This rotating system of warmth allows the colony to survive even in subarctic temperatures, maintaining a core heat that ensures the survival of the queen until the first blossoms of spring signal the rebirth of the foraging season. The honeybee has never been merely an insect to humanity. It has been a symbol, a deity, and a mirror. Long before we understood the mathematics of the hexagon, or the genetics of the hive, we sensed a divinity in the honeymaker. In the sun-drenched temples of ancient Egypt, the bee was believed to have been born from the tears of the sun god, Ra. As his tears fell upon the desert sands, they transformed into golden bees that flew off to pollinate the world. To the Egyptians, the bee was a symbol of royalty and the soul, its honey a substance so incorruptible that it accompanied pharaohs into the afterlife, jars of which have been found in tombs, still edible after 3,000 years, a testament to the bee's mastery over time and decay. This reverence spanned the globe. In the Hellenic world, the Melissae were the bee priestesses of Demeter and Artemis, representing the purity of the hive and the industry of the soul. The Delphic oracle herself was often referred to as the Delphic bee, her prophecies likened to the sweet, intoxicating nectar of truth. For the ancients, the hive was the perfect model for human society, a place where the common good outweighed individual ego, where order was maintained without coercion, and where the fruit of one's labor was a sweetness that nourished the entire community. This bee-man connection suggests that our own evolution may have been guided by the pursuit of honey, a high-energy fuel that sparked the development of the early human brain. As centuries passed, this spiritual bond evolved into a deeply intimate folklore. Perhaps most moving is the European tradition of telling the bees. For generations, it was believed that the bees were members of the family, and as such, they had to be kept informed of all major life events. When a birth, a marriage, or most crucially, a death occurred in the house, a member of the family would go to the hives, tap gently on the wood, and whisper the news. If a master died, the hives were often draped in black crepe. It was believed that if the bees were not told, they would take offense, stop producing honey, or leave the hive entirely. This ritual reflects a profound psychological truth. We have always viewed the bee as a bridge between the domestic and the wild, the living and the spirit world. In the medieval era, the bee became a symbol of Christian virtue. Saint Ambrose, the patron saint of beekeepers, compared the church to a hive and it devoted to the tireless workers. The wax of the bee was deemed the only substance pure enough to light the altars of God, as it was produced by virgins who did not engage in the perceived sin of sexual reproduction. Every flickering candle in a cathedral was a tribute to the silent labor of the hive. This period also saw the rise of the master of the bees, a respected figure in the village who understood the mysterious rhythms of the season and the subtle language of the swarm. However, the dawn of the Industrial Revolution and the subsequent rise of intensive agriculture began to shift the paradigm. The bee transitioned from a sacred companion to a biological commodity. In the 19th century, L. Langstroth's invention of the movable frame hive revolutionized beekeeping, allowing for the extraction of honey without destroying the colony. While this was a leap forward for conservation, it also marked the beginning of the industrialization of the bee. No longer were they stationary residents of a local garden. They became a migratory workforce. Today, millions of hives are trucked across continents to provide pollination services for monocultures, vast, emerald deserts of almonds, apples, and berries that stretch as far as the eye can see. This brings us to the modern era, where the golden architect faces its greatest challenge. The very systems we built to feed a burgeoning human population are the ones currently dismantling the world of the bee. We are witnessing the phenomenon of colony collapse disorder, a haunting term for a reality where worker bees simply vanish, leaving behind a healthy queen and a hive full of honey. It is a biological Mary Celeste, a disappearance that signals a profound systemic failure. The causes are a death by 1,000 cuts, the loss of floral diversity due to urban sprawl, the rise of the Varroa destructor mite, and the pervasive use of neonicotinoid pesticides, chemicals that cross the blood-brain barrier of the bee, scrambling their navigation and leaving them unable to find their way home. The loss of the bee would not merely mean a world without honey. It would mean a world of gray plates and nutritional poverty. 1 out of every 3 bites of food we eat is the direct result of bee pollination. From the cotton in our clothes to the alfalfa that feeds our livestock, the invisible threads of the bee's flight hold the tapestry of our civilization together. If the bees were to disappear, the collapse of the global food chain would follow with terrifying speed. We are beginning to realize that the telling of the bees was never just a superstition. It was a recognition of our interdependence. If we fail to listen to what the bees are telling us now, through their silence and their struggle, we risk losing more than just an insect. We risk losing the sweetness of the world itself. Thank you and good night.